So excited to have you all here. Real quick background on me. I'm Parth with Polimorphic. My background, I'm actually an engineer by training, so my path is a little bit roundabout. So I did electrical engineering, computer science at MIT, focused on AI and machine learning while there. We thought it was the big new thing then, and it feels like it's 1,000 times bigger now. But I ran the machine intelligence community for 2 years, and at the time, this was before LLMs, any of that was a thing, right? But from that experience, I spent some time with the city of Boston on some smart cities initiatives. And the city of Boston was really focused on, how can we use data and data analytics to plan safer cities? They have all this data around where car accidents were happening, where their infrastructure assets were. So when we decide to put a stop sign up, we don't really look at anything, right? We just kind of say, should we put one up or not, right? So that was their kind of initial project that they were trying to do. And as part of spending time with their organization, what I learned, which is going to be a very obvious insight to y'all, but to me it was very, very novel at the time, was how much time and effort was spent really around what I call customer service operations, right? That was like the heart of what the city does. Whatever department it is, whether it's answering questions, offering services, a lot of time by staff is spent there. And I've had kind of a personal tie to that too. My family background's in this world. Going back to my grandfather, who's a utility director his whole career, grandmother worked in state government. I think a lot of the technology world thinks of government, I think, second, right? They think of the private sector first, and that's usually their primary buyer. And there's often a lack of appreciation too, right? I think a lot of people will say, hey, why can't we offer services like XYZ company? And I think what people don't recognize is customer service is infinitely more complicated with government. And I'll give a simple example. In the private sector, if you have a customer that is, for whatever reason, like it's a complicated user flow or whatever, it's not something that you standard support, and where it might be expensive or complicated to make sure that we cover that full group. In the private sector, the answer is you just don't, right? You can choose like, hey, we're only going to serve a portion of our customers, right? And those are our profitable customers, so to speak. That's not the case in government, right? We serve all of our constituents, residents, businesses, visitors, and that makes it very challenging. And so today I've kind of got like a two-parter here. So we'll first talk about where high level, some of the exciting stuff we're seeing across the country on how AI is helping with everything from resident questions to website improvements, which I'm sure is a topic top of mind. And the second area we're going to talk about, which is I hope more interesting, because there's a lot of conversations around like how to build your own chatbot or chatbot this, chatbot that. I think there's a lot of unique things to government flows, right? It makes it a little bit more complicated than working with, hey, let's just take a GPT, put it with like a retrieval, augmented generation, have our vector DB, and just let it run. Like there's a lot more complex use cases, and I'm going to coin this today, I don't know if it's a thing. 2.0, like what's a chatbot 2.0 look like for government, right? What are the other flows that are unique and very challenging, and where it gets hard to just take something that's out of the box in the private sector or these models, and actually where I think there's some really unique use cases for your residents where they'll be excited about that experience you're now offering. So we'll start with the opportunity. And one thing we hear a lot is the website's starting to become, I would say, it's moving just from an essential piece of your digital infrastructure to now it's starting to become that kind of knowledge base for many other ways in which people will engage with AI. And that, I think, is a subtle but unique shift, right? So a lot of I mentioned probably in the panel earlier, like we're helping a lot with phone systems and things like that. Well, that's great. That's not really the website at all. But one of the big knowledge bases that's powering that is the content on the website. And so I think that's leading to a really interesting expansion, I think, in the responsibilities that go into managing the websites. So a lot of folks we work with, traditionally we have analytics on what pages folks are going to. Some of y'all might be looking at search analytics, and that gives us some insight into what residents care about the most, right? What AI is starting to do now, which is really helpful, is it's giving us semantic analysis there too, right? So a lot of keywords we might not catch that actually are very similar questions. One of my favorites is in Michigan, a lot of people ask about opening cafes, right? What permits I need. And if I want to serve coffee or beverages, like what are the difference there? And those are complex keywords that are actually very related to someone who's opening a completely different type of business. But what they are related to is permitting, right? And so that's a very interesting realization of going beyond keywords with AI now. You can actually, if y'all are familiar kind of with like these vector databases, what you're taking is words and putting them in these really complex, high-dimensional numbers, essentially, like a list of numbers. But what it tells you is when things have similar meanings. And so that's a really interesting new benefit we have, is we can start to group content in ways without having to manually comb through, okay, this keyword similar to this keyword, or this keyword similar to that. It can actually understand the meaning of things. And that starts to give us insight onto maybe we want to lay out our website differently or things like that. So by the numbers, we've done some studies with folks, and it varies organization to organization. Roughly 70 to 80% of questions are about website content, right? It is somewhere on your site. Some of the common questions I would say is like the how do I's, right? That's probably one of the most common. How do I do this? How do I do that? And I think that's something that's a little bit unique because we are so used to how internally our organization runs. We know what departments handle what. We know which page sometimes and which drop-down menu to go through to find that content. Most residents are not going to know that, right? They rarely even know which departments handle which kind of issues. Like my favorite example is on a lot of these phone trees or sites, people will think about permitting questions. I want to start a business, and they'll look at, say, economic development. That's the number one trap they fall into, right? Economy development makes a ton of sense. Feels like that should be what I need to do. And yes, they can help in terms of attracting business, but they're probably not going to help you with permitting, right? And so, that's probably in the world of planning and zoning or community development, which community development feels like would not be obvious to permitting. So that's a big area. Who do I contact is an interesting one. A lot of times we expect people to know, and if you search by name, you'll find someone, right? But very rarely do people know XYZ person is the person I need to get in front of for my question. And I think that's the mindset. When you start to think about from the customer-centric perspective, right? We might know that, okay, in IT, it's, Scott Persons in IT, that's who I need to reach out to. But if I'm asking a completely different question, how do I know that without knowing Scott is in my organization, that's where I need to end up? So, as you can imagine, this is very challenging, right? When we talk to a lot of folks, one of the biggest concerns about making AI public-facing is, hey, we have all this content on our website, we don't know what's out of date. Like, we're worried about it giving incorrect answers, not because it's incorrect, but because we have pages that haven't been updated in a while, or maybe we've lost track of them. Maybe there's PDFs that are 3 years old and that they're just outdated. So the first few areas that I think are very interesting is whose understanding of the world or whose paradigm do websites fit? And I think this is where I kind of mentioned it's a tough problem, right? There's so many different services offered. Which ones am I going to prioritize, right? Which ones am I going to put at the top? And I think of it in the sense of like websites, whether we realize it or not, in many ways they're built for staff, not residents, right? They're built for staff, not residents. You go to, the CIO of Rowan County is a good friend of ours, and he's fantastic. One of the really innovative around AI and technology. And one things he remembered telling me was like, hey, if you just go to our top menu and just look at it, hover on departments and see just like all the different menus and sub-menus. He's like, how much of that do you think makes any sense to our residents? And I was like, that's a fair point, right? I would never know which link to click into. And for years, I think the best tool we've had to kind of bridge this for residents is search, right? Search has been like that solution, right? You click in a keyword and we've gotten used to it using Google and tools like that, but if you really think about it, it's a very unnatural way of interacting with technology, right? In real life, when's the last time you went up to someone and you had a question, and instead of like asking a question, you were like, permits, cafe, permits, right? Like we don't interact like that. We interact in full sentences, we have context, we have meaning, but that's how we've like had to mold our brain to interact with search to get the most use out of it, because that's how the technology works, right? So we are molding our patterns, our behavior to what technology is capable of. And now with AI, we're starting to flip that back into technology starting to meet us in where it's natural for us to interact, right? So I think in tasks, they think in questions, they don't think in departments. They don't think in like random link or in documents, this PDF in this drop-down menu, right? So that's a big thing. The other one, which I hearing from a lot of y'all, I think the big theme we keep hearing about is accessibility, right? In Colorado especially, the timeline got moved up, and we've worked with the team in Castle Pines and Littleton and others, and it's really interesting to see the value of that, because PDFs has become, for a long time, was one of the default ways we just put in content. It was like a really easy way to say, okay, I'm going to create content very quickly and then just throw it in a PDF and it's out there. But now it's starting to become clear that remediating those are expensive or difficult. And then you add that with a lot of the content that we find in PDFs. So one of the areas that's challenging is code, right? Municipal code, I know it's not often officially on the websites linked out. I don't know if y'all use like Municode or eCode or tools like that, but it's legal jargon, right? Fundamentally, it's like a legal document that folks use. And forget for residents, sometimes it's hard for staff to understand, right? That is like a very complicated piece of content. And we've started to see that oftentimes there's conflicts too. So the website content might start to say something about guidance around applying for certain permits or how this works, and it's actually in conflict with that legal document, right? So you start to run into these issues, right? Search gaps, outdated links, and conflicting information. So that, I think, has become kind of the challenges with this great tool we have in the websites in terms of making information more accessible, making it easy for people to access and learn about any services. The counterpoint is like all that content we have to manage it. And I don't know how to tell y'all this because I'm sure y'all deal with it daily. Is like your departments are often your, what's the term again? They're your
navigation.
Well, I'm trying to think of the domain experts, right? They're domain experts in all these pieces, but y'all are in charge of kind of making sure that they're keeping their stuff up to date. It's another thing on their task, right? They might not be the most familiar in how to manage the web interface, making sure content's up to date. So that leads to a little bit of a challenge. And we call that kind of content drift, right? They might have moved their practices forward. They might have updated their internal SOPs, but the website is kind of lagging in making sure that those updates are reflected to the public. And that leads to a lot of challenges. So how do you avoid that content drift, and how do you actually prioritize it, right? In some ways, that's maybe the bigger question, is which pieces of content do we need to update the soonest, or which ones are the most relevant to residents? Because some of it, we can't keep up with all of it. Sometimes the best we can do is prioritize. And I think that's where these tools, taking search to the next level, and why we're seeing so much excitement and appetite around chatbots or AI search and things like that, is it's starting to at least give semantic clues into where residents seem more interested. That's where people are realizing these are where we need to keep the content drift gaps the lowest. So a little bit of like categories on analytics. I think, Chris, you did a presentation yesterday, which I wasn't able to go to, but it was on analytics. And like everyone's talking about AI and accessibility, and analytics is extremely important, right? Because it tells you a lot about what you can do. And I think we think about analytics in a variety of ways of what's interesting to our residents, but in many ways, it's a feedback loop, right? You're probably starting to think about, I'm sure a lot of y'all on the website, there's like 3 or 4 like quick links or like 6 quick links. And you start to use that insight from website analytics on which quick links should be there. We're starting to see in cases where there's seasonality, people change those based on what's going on. So going back to the example with Rowan County, in the winter, they have an energy assistance program, and that is one of their most visited websites. So in November, that's a good time to turn that on and put that in your quick links. So that's a good place for analytics. And that's where, a lot of this AI, omni-channel AIs can start to give more clues, right? Where people are reaching out over phone calls or emails. I don't know if y'all have seen like that meme with the plane and like the targets that have hit the plane. Have you guys seen this? So okay, it's a plane, and back in the day, when I believe it was like the British Air Force, I could be wrong about this, but I think in World War II the planes would come back and they were keeping track of where damage happened on the plane, right? And they noticed a lot of it was on the wings and the back wings, and they said, well, we should reinforce that, because if that's where the damage is happening, that means we should probably fix it. What they realized over time, though, too, was interesting, was those are the planes that came back. Right, so those are the ones that actually were fine, and like it was just you could survive handling that content. So I think that's another thing that is interesting with web analytics, and this is maybe a stretch of an analogy, but those are folks who are visiting your website, right? And so that's only a portion of where questions, content, and resident services happen, right? A significant portion, probably the majority, are on phone calls, right? And so how many people are not even getting the website or just picking up the phone and calling and are ignoring that search or ignoring that website visit because they just couldn't find what they're looking for and are calling in? So that's where these advantages of, as you start to move omni-channel, trying to bring all those analytics together, it's actually very relevant to your website too, because you might find that people are just scrolling to the bottom, calling that number, and that's not something that is easy to see without maybe some of those heat map trackers and things like that. But what are they even calling about? You've lost the data and visibility into that customer journey once that phone call's happened, right? So, the way we see it is it's really like that feedback loop, right? It's a continuous improvement tool. Obviously, there's value in Q&A, but I think as you start to roll this out in multiple channels, if you can start to see what are folks calling about, we actually did this with, I think we just sent it over to Littleton, Colorado, where they were using the chat and then voice with us. We actually built out like a Sankey diagram for them, right? So what are like the most common transfers and questions? And Scott there is fantastic, but he was like, we've never had this much visibility. And so he's starting to think about what content they should probably be floating up, because now he has it on the website, on the phone, text, all these other channels you could roll it out on, right? And so it's starting to become that kind of continuous improvement tool where we start to prioritize what the first views residents should see if they come to our site are. We can start to think about which pages of content or which departments we really need to stay on to make sure the content's up to date. This is a common question or something that folks are commonly asking. Where are they asking follow-ups, right? That's another piece of interesting insight. Like if they're getting their question answered, but it's not enough, right? Maybe there's more content, more depth that we're missing there too. So that's kind of part one I wanted to talk about and just give a few kind of quick case studies of what we've seen. And I tried to keep these a little bit different into like what they were able to do with that. So Pacifica, amazing team there. They just won the Helen Putnam Award, which they're very excited about. But one thing that they realized is they started to put a lot of content in here is they have so many different services. They use different services for like business licenses is like outsourced there and just a bunch of complexity. What they're realizing was people are actually really struggling to find that information as a result because they would get confused when it directed them off the site, took them to like HDL or some other place. What they're realizing that about 40% of the questions were about processes that are already on the site or linked on the site, but weren't easy to get to. And so what ended up happening is they started reorganizing the kind of homepage and the key kind of department pages as well, because sometimes people enter directly to there through Google searches or other things. And so it's really interesting to see. Obviously, the AI directly answers the questions, but what they started to think about was how do we use those metrics to start to reshape where our content's laid out, where we want to add links, what forms we need to simplify, which priority we have on that, which is very interesting. Amra, Wisconsin, much smaller organization, but they actually kind of started to use it from the staff side too, which was I thought pretty interesting. So they created kind of like this enhanced search, same idea, but what they realized was they were missing a lot of content, or some of the terminology was different, right? The way residents would refer to things was different. We actually just ran into this with another county in California. I forget the term, but there's like a different term for ADUs. Like I think people call them, I forget, granny flats or something is the official term, or the slang term, which is, I had never heard of, but people were asking that question. And so what they started to do is add this idea of like synonyms or like kind of content that how people ask it might be different from what our documentation says. So I think that's another area that was really interesting in terms of expanding their content. Maybe that's just like other keywords you're adding because you probably want to keep the official terminology, but just making sure that metadata allows for matching on some other ways people might be referring to the official technical terms we use in government. Castle Pines, local, not too far from here. They're absolutely great. One of the things that they're running to was on the accessibility side, right? They have a ton of PDFs, and they were in this, they're about 7,000 residents for context, so I think they were trying to calculate like how much it would cost them to remediate all their PDFs, right? I think the number came out to like somewhere between 100 and 200 grand. Like it was some obscene amount, right? And for that size of population, like that's not an easy amount of dollars to just find, especially with the timelines getting pushed forward. So their plan was to take down all the content. Like that was frankly the plan, which is not an ideal effect, but that was really the only choice they had in that situation. What they ended up doing, which was pretty exciting, is they actually put it into that AI search. And the AI search is like WCAG, level AA, compliant, all of that, as hidden links. So you could still answer questions on it, but you couldn't click through and see those PDFs. So it was an interesting use case in their head of how do we keep that content available without coming into risk with accessibility lawsuits and making sure that we're doing a good job there. So overall, improved equity access, reducing call volumes, stronger resident trust and satisfaction, and I think the other one is you start to see between departments, like where are those interactions, where's that data, where are those connections. So into kind of phase 2, which I'm excited to talk about, is like what I call this like chatbot 2.0, right? And there's been talk about, will websites even look the same anymore, right? I've heard some conversation with people like, hey, what if it just looked like when you enter ChatGPT, it's just like it's a query box, right? And in theory, why did we create websites, right? Really, if you're thinking about from the customer experience, is to provide information, insight, explanation of services. And the second one is it's your brand, right? It's your brand. It's your visual language by which you're communicating. And what's happening is if you start to move towards that realization of, okay, for that first category, actually potentially a better experience is some highlighted top things, and then you basically got this really big like chat style interface. It starts to put more influence on that visual brand, right? And that's where you start to see some time to think about, like that's where you can personalize, that's where you can go deeper. My vision, I don't know if it's possible, but I'm curious what some of the website companies are thinking about. Eventually, I could really see a world in which each user who comes to your site has a different layout based on the previous questions or previous pages they've interacted with, right? In theory, if I've asked questions about permitting a lot, maybe I'm a contractor, and so maybe those links should be highlighted. Imagine if those quick links or top results are actually different for each website visitor, right? So there's some interesting, pros and then challenges to think about there too. Like if we want to specifically communicate out certain information, make sure it's a fair or like similar experience for everyone, how does that relate with personalization? But it's interesting from an opportunity standpoint, right? We've always thought about, we went from like static, like back in the day, like old vanilla HTML to like, okay, now it's interactive and you get engaged, and then web applications you sign into and there's certain content. But I could really imagine these website experiences becoming extremely dynamic to what folks have asked, what folks have engaged with, etc. It starts to retain that memory of what that individual has engaged with us on. So where does this get more complicated than just Q&A, right? And I think this is where we are really getting interested in going deeper. So as we started to dive into questions, I mentioned like the how do I's, the what do I do's, etc. And this is kind of where I see a joke like chatbot 2.0. Because basic chatbots are, you ask me a question, I respond, right? But that's not good enough, right? Because in government, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of complexity. I told my team this, I was like, hey, whoever answers this type of question first is like, that is a unique experience. And the question I told them was, can I build a swimming pool in my backyard, right? And the reason I mentioned that is like, it's just such a silly, simple question, but it's not that simple. It's actually very, very complicated, because the truth is you cannot answer that question in one shot. You shouldn't answer that question in one shot, because the answer is, it depends, right? It really does depend. Where's your address, right? What are you zoned as? So I think GIS is going to be something really interesting that I'm not seeing as much in the private sector in terms of innovating that and bring that into the user experience, but it's going to be a really interesting thought experiment. When you interact with ChatGPT, you're usually just typing, right? You type a response, you type back, etc. We're going to have more multimedia experiences, right? So I might not always be just writing text. Sometimes I might get an interactive UI element where I actually drop a pin or can enter an address, and it's guiding me through that a little bit greater. So that's something that's really interesting. So some common ones I threw up there is like, when is my trash picked up, right? In a lot of counties you have different routes, different schedules, right? What school district am I in? Who's my commissioner? Who's my council member? even when you think about potholes, it depends. You have county roads, state roads, and then you have your municipal ones. So all that's going to start to become pretty interesting change in terms of a standard text-to-text-to-text interface might not be good enough, right? Then you go a little bit deeper, and how many of y'all are familiar with tools, like in this phrase of tools in LLMs? Okay, so tools is like the term they've started to use for LLMs being able to use it as like something in their tool set that they can pull data from or make a request to, but almost like these resources they have, right? And so what's an example in government where that's useful? Take utility billing, right? If I were to ask a chat or a voice agent or something like, hey, when's my next bill due? Your static website content, even your code content, can't really capture that. What I need to know is probably what your account number is. I might want to do certain kind of validations, like making sure that it's your name and address, so no one else is just calling in to get your account balance. So there's a lot of things like that. So this is like in this world of tools, it's going to be building out these interactions with either internal systems you have, external systems that are relevant, other resources that are available. And so all of a sudden, you can imagine use cases from events to utilities to permit status, work order status. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I think what that's putting insight and a little bit of pressure on is for those legacy systems is, do we have a way to even interface with them, right? So a lot of these systems don't even have really, frankly, good or secure APIs to work with, right? And so that becomes a really big challenge is if you want to start to be able to answer questions, those the non-simple ones, like the how do I's, the what do I do, like that's where folks get frustrated. Like how many of y'all have called like an airline agent and it's like, what's my bag status or whatever, and it's like, it's so frustrating, like agent, right? And the reason is a lot of people think it's like, oh, people want to talk to humans. I do agree with that a little bit, but I would actually counter that in the sense of people want to get help. They want to actually get their situation resolved. There's a lot of cases where I can call a person and they're not very helpful in those airline agents, right? The problem in that situation is not the fact that I'm not talking to a human person. The problem is that robot, like pre-programmed response agent is unable to give me dynamic information on what my bag status might be or whether I can rebook a flight. So its action set is too limited. It can only do like really basic static questions. And that's why tools is really interesting, right? So you might even launch a chatbot and it might be really great and answer static questions, and you might still get frustration from residents because they're like, it can't answer all these questions I really want to answer, and their question might be like, what's my account balance? They think that's a really reasonable question to answer, right? So I just want to talk to a person now because a person can answer it. But what is your staff doing? They're actually looking into, whatever that system is, whether it's in Tyler or Harris or whatever, they're actually pulling that up, they're asking for the account number, they're asking for what their name is, and actually providing a more detailed answer. So that's going to be an important thing with AI rollouts is we will see frustration if we're not thinking about, and it will be very easy to just default into, they want to talk to a person, or we just need to route that to a person. I think there's opportunities to look for what are they asking, right? And making sure that if we can resolve their issue, resolve their question, there's a lot of opportunity there. And the simple example I would say to that is like if they call at 6 p.m. and you could answer that, that's the key. Because at 6 p.m. you wouldn't get a hold of a person either, right? So that's why tools is really interesting. So the next three, there's a lot of talk about hallucinations, and with any LLM, that is a concern and thing to think through, right? I think one of the two areas that I would say is the most foundational to rolling out AI, accuracy and speed. Like those two are really, really important. And accuracy is obvious. I don't think I need to convince anyone of why accuracy is important, but speed is really interesting. So speed, one of the things that we're comfortable with in web experiences is load times, right? We have some concept. You give me a loading indicator and you can get clever with those indicators. People are willing to be a little bit patient. They're used to that as an experience. Where this gets really, really difficult is on the phone. So on the phone, if someone calls in, we are used to a certain type of interaction, right? When someone is in a conversation with you, really what your brain is doing is you're starting to respond immediately to provide feedback on, hey, I have heard you, I understand, I'm going to come finish your answer. And that's when your brain has already started to process what's that response going to be, and then you fill it in, right? So that latency is really, really low, right? If we were in a conversation, I waited 3-4 seconds to respond, you'd be like, they hear my question? Like, what's going on, right? So speed becomes really, really important. And to make speed really effective, I think there's a lot of challenges, right? Which is, take that swimming pool example again, or another one would be like where there might be multiple references in the code. So like, let's say I do provide the address, I come back and start looking through the code. There's gonna be a few steps there actually, because I might wanna look at not just that, but any other adjacent like ordinances that might relate to fences or other guidance I need around my pool, right? Some other stuff I should know. So speed doesn't necessarily mean the time to the final answer. It's more about the speed at which I'm interacting with you. So what's going to start to happen, I think where you can kind of bridge that gap, is have your AI agents be extremely communicative as it's making steps. So if you were doing that as a person, right, you're not going to give your answer in 2 seconds either, right? You're going to probably have to look through the code and do a few lookups. So what do you do on the phone when you're doing multiple lookups and things like that? You say, hey, one second, let me just look into this. Okay, I'm looking into the fence pieces too, because that might be relevant to your issue. Okay, I found something here. Okay, so here's what it says, right? And so that's all of a sudden, like, that was maybe 15 seconds for me to give that answer. But the transparency in the middle is really key too. So those are the two that we talk about. Context awareness, that's a really big one, right? I think I see this mistake a lot with like very kind of basic RAG chatbots that are out there, is they lose context completely. Like my favorite question is like, how do I get a building permit? And then I follow up with, how much does it cost? And my favorite is like 90% of ones I run to fail that simple test. Why? It will say like, what does it mean? Or it's like, pulls up some random cost thing, because it's lost track of the fact that obviously I'm asking about how much does a building permit cost, but I'm not going to write it out in full sentences, because that's not how constituents think. So that's a really big thing, is making sure that our AI experiences are very context aware. And I think that's a very simple test to check that. You might not have the information, but at least it should know, like, I don't have information about building permit costs, right? But if it says, I don't know what it is, and clarify that for me, I mean, that's a problem. Like, that's going to be a very big problem very quickly, because there's a ton of questions that, as residents get more and more familiar with your technology, that pain point is going to get even higher, because they're going to act more and more casually with it, more and more conversational. And I think integrations is that key piece. We talked about tools, and I really like, what I like really emphasize is, as y'all are out there like procuring other technologies, things are completely unrelated, right? I think someone mentioned, like, maybe you said this about Chris, on accessibility, like framing it around AI and using that. I would use that same talk track to start to push for tools that have proper APIs or proper things you can integrate with. Like I say this as a vendor, I've been shocked in this space how many other organizations like refuse to integrate. And I think it's at the loss of the customer, right? It's at the loss of the cities and counties, because sometimes you go out and you want to get something new and it's some advantage over, or at some supplementary feature, and your core permitting technology or ERP solution is just unable to integrate, or it's going to take way too much professional service hours, whatever. I think that's going to become a non-negotiable going forward for technology. I really emphasize that. Like, AI is going to be only as good as, we talk about the data, but also the access, right? If you can't access these systems, that you're not going to be able to answer questions on that. Talking about tools, the other one we're really excited about, we have this thing called connected agencies or connected communities that we've been doing a lot. So we work with this county in New Jersey, Passaic County, and they've been working with us for probably a better part of 2 years. But one of the things that they realized, which was interesting, is they have, I think, 20 municipalities within the county. And people ask a ton of municipal questions to the county website, because they don't know what is a municipal service, what's a county service, and what's a state agency service, right? And so this is like the next tier up of the problem of the departments, right? So we already have the departments problem we established, but that's in our control, right? These are our departments, we have our content. This is now going beyond us, right? Which is, people are asking us questions that we don't offer that service at all, right? And so how do you manage that? So one of the things that is really interesting is starting to build what we kind of call an ontology or mapping of who provides what services and which are connected organizations to you. So that could either be adjacent organizations, that could be municipalities within or the county above, and then the state agencies that are related to that too. And so what we've done in their case is we actually built out 16 AI agents for each of their municipalities. We connected that to GIS. So now if you ask a question on a municipal service, it can ask you your address and will route you to that municipal services agent, and it clarifies that, hey, this is not the county's information, but yeah, this is where we're pulling it. And so I think that's a really interesting example when we think about no wrong door, right? There's no wrong door in our organization, making sure that regardless of what department you want to go to, doesn't matter. You call the main number, you go to the chat on the search, we'll answer your question, right? This goes a level beyond that, which is whatever service you want, right? Even if we don't offer it, we will make sure we get you to where you need to be, right? Which I think is a very, very exciting opportunity, right? We're starting to abstract away we're really starting to meet customers where they're at, right? Customers and our constituents, maybe like they think of everything as this is the county, this is the city. They actually really think of everything as this is just the government, right? I don't know who handles in the government, but I need to reach out. So I think that's a really big opportunity to collaborate too with your local agencies as well, right? As you start to think about your AI plan, et cetera, like recognize that you will get a lot of questions that are related to them, and how do you partner on that, right? I think that's a really unique opportunity for intergovernmental partnership, and some places I think you have like shared services organizations or coordinators in certain counties. I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and we've seen a lot of engagement from them trying to get it to be more of a unified effort on some of these things. Okay, so where to start? There's a lot of stuff to do. Obviously, you've got your website content keeping an update. I think there's a lot of great tools out there, right? You got chatbots, voice assistants, internal AI tools. What I'll say is like most ones that, there are folks out there who can do it quickly, and I think that is something that we're not used to sometimes with big technology implementations. Part of the reason is the way AI is implemented is so unique, right? Especially this public-facing pieces, it's not requiring it to get into our internal workflows as much. It just requires the content. So compared to when you onboard like a Excella or something in permitting, right? You now got to train everyone in your buildings department on how do we use this, how do we process it, et cetera. That will happen with AI as you start to go deeper into internal flows and internal use cases, but there's an opportunity here where some of this is, as long as the content's good, the training lift is actually surprisingly low from a standpoint of changing your workflows, right? It's more about content management, getting information up there. So, I think that's a really exciting thing. Logs, I think the transparency is very key as you start to get that question data, that insight. That's going to be really, really exciting, and that might drive a bunch of other ideas you have on like website layout, patterns you're seeing, content changes. We talked about content drift. And then you start to think about like where you can reduce some of those repetitive questions too, right? Well, how do we make those repetitive questions easier and easier for us to handle, right? Go from many clicks to 2 clicks to a click and a text to eventually a quick link, right? Whatever that path is, right? Always trying to reduce the number of steps of friction. And so that, that gets to the future where I mentioned like, we're not in the website business. This is me just making a prediction here. But I do think eventually like websites will start to learn, right? And they will adapt and almost dynamically do that, right? They will be reactive to what folks ask. They'll be reactive to seasonal changes or what they're seeing in terms of content that's being asked. I think it'll become a really exciting opportunity. Like obviously you get the feedback loop in, but I do think like some of it will be connecting your AI, omni-channel AI with your website providers, and I'm sure in the future they will take, they will build integrations with that to help adapt their content and restructure it, relay it out. So I think that's like my exciting pitch for the future is like, why does this matter now? Like this is what's going to happen. I believe in a few years, this is a completely different way we interact with the web, right? Where every experience is personalized. I could imagine eventually like browsers having settings where it's like, this is how I like content laid out, etc. And your browser is actually like retranslating every single website you interact with into a specific hyper-personalized local version of it. And so what that will mean is like we're going to be focused on two things, right? Content and what's that visual brand, right? And those are the two things that are going to make it through that hyper-personalization. So yeah, takeaways, and I want to leave some time for questions. AI is constantly able to document and listen and give you that insight. It's been really awesome to see people, how excited they are about even just having logs. Like, hey, what are people calling in about, right? That's a big thing. It's been very hard to do that. The other solution is I get all my front desk staff to write down all their posted notes, transcribe them, put them into like a CRM. It's a lot of work, right? It's bridging gaps, right, between how we provide service and the analytics we have. And then it's one of those things where we talk about like impact, and I talk a lot about like this customer service being like the laundry and dishes. And if we can like really reduce that, the real impact is not the time savings. The impact is what we do with that time we get back, right? I think that's a really exciting opportunity where we're seeing already amazing things where health and human services departments are running more programs. Parks departments are getting more time back. We work with the animal shelter where they were able to reduce their voicemails by 95%, which came out to basically 20 hours a week. And they said that was like a part-time role for us. We just got a part-time role back, and now we're able to do more events with that front desk. The front desk who was there, she was like, I can now do all these other initiatives I wanted to get around to. So it might seem small. I know there's a lot of chatter about AI, but the impact is really what it allows y'all to do with that time you get back. So with that, I know a conversation y'all have is how are you convincing, oftentimes council, commissioners, other folks in the organization on, hey, like I would imagine we're all pretty forward looking here. We're taking time out of work to show up here and engage with peers and really learn about all this amazing stuff that's out there. And so we've been trying to, someone asked a really good question to the panel, like how do you even think about ROI? And so we tried to lay out a little bit. Hopefully that's helpful as you think about all those initiatives you're thinking about. It's a little ebook, but it goes through a few different ways you can think about the ROI and where it could be helpful. So feel free to go ahead and scan that, and then I put my contact information there, and I'll leave the last, I think, like 16, 17 minutes here for questions.
Yeah, so if I had a AI session / webinar bingo card, it would have agentic on it.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody's talking about agents and agentic functionality. And I thought it was interesting. You didn't mention agentic anything, but how do you see that fitting into the future or the roadmap to this the next wave of user experience with the web, particularly with governments?
Yeah, no, I think so. Part of the reason I don't mention agentic is which I'll get to, but is I've kind of tried to stay at the foundational level with tools and things like that, because agents basically where it builds on top of that has the choice, it has the ability to make decisions instead of pre-described flows, right? But I think it's a really interesting thing from y'all's end. I think it's going to push more and more on the accuracy side, and the reason I say that is with agents, your error compounds, right? Because if I'm 99% accurate, which is actually pretty good, but if I have an agent which can make multiple decisions, might do additional lookups, come back, I need to make this other call to utilities, come back, pull some information from code, etc., your error starts to compound very quickly. So if it's like 3, 4, 5 steps, 99 times 99 times 99 starts to travel a lot quicker, right? So I think that's just one thing to think about. I don't know. The other side of it is how other people start to use agents. And I think people are already starting to do this with OpenAI's added, I think, an element in it already with partnerships with Shopify and others where you can just buy right in application. And so I think that is very, I don't want to say concerning, but I would say like that is pushing, I think, urgency from governments on, hey, we need to make sure we've got, whether it's like we're providing an MCP interface or whatever it is, but we have our kind of white labeled AI experience, if you come to our site at least. Because if people don't see that, I think what's happening is people are just using it anyways. And I think that's becoming a concern, which is, if those agents, they can call tools and pull from data that is not essentially white labeled by y'all, right? So it might be pulling, like if I'm like, hey, pay my tax bill. I think someone was giving an example, it was kind of where like, someone copied one over, right, and they used like a different county's name or something in the title data or something. But that's an example of where like an agent could get tripped up on something like that, and all of a sudden they pay taxes in a different county or something.
It was a title tag in code on on sub pages that had a different county's name on it,
Right.
which means if they came to the home page, you had the right county. If the next page that went down, all of a sudden thought you were on a different county's website.
Right.
Yeah.
So and then that's the thing when it's and to no fault, like ChatGPT, these tools are fantastic. It's just that they're not in your control, right? They're not your experience. And so I think I kind of think of it as like if ChatGPT is playing offense, like we have our own tools, like that's our defense, right? Like we're getting ahead of it, right? We're seeing this also in cases of like people are using AI to massively increase the amount of public records requests they're submitting. So that's just like another example. Like when we think about DDoS, right? We've always thought about that as like the number of requests sent in, but I think there's going to be entirely new types of distributed denial of service. Like in theory, I could have agents that sound human calling your phone lines, and a resident might never get through to any of your departments. That hasn't happened yet, but if it did, there's reasons why people would want to like governments are prime targets, right? So I think there's a lot that. One of the big reasons I think like urgency is just so important is like, yes, we obviously want to be diligent. We want to make sure we get things right. But the reason I push that urgency is like everyone else is not waiting and y'all are a prime target for a lot of things. And so, I guess that's my take on the agent side.
What are your recommendations for getting organizations to think about content readiness for AI implementation and not just jumping into having a chatbot on the website, for example?
So and I think this is something that like a lot of technology companies like sometimes we get in this trap of like, oh, just use the technology and it's great, right? And it's not enough, right? Like there's technology, there's processes, there's people, and you kind of need all three to fold together. So I think with the content readiness side, I think one is like the broader conversation is this role shift, right? Which is imagine like you're a front desk in Monmouth County, New Jersey Health and Human Services, right? Your job for years has been we answer the same questions over and over again. We're on the phones. What does it mean to be more of like a content manager? Because if I have these tools available to me in the future, actually the highest leverage task I could be doing is making sure that our content for that or these SOPs, etc., are extremely well written or clear and always up to date. And I'm now taken me handling one call at a time to now this body of agents I have that can handle 10, 20, 100, right? So I think some of that is starting to think about what's the transitory state to eventually when we have people who are managing agents to right now we're handling calls, what does that in between look like? I think with content readiness, the other thing is already with like search engine optimization and things like that, there's been a lot around like machine readability. And I think that's going to become more and more important. Like we see a lot of sites where you'll see images without like area labels and things like that, and like that's tricky because like AI can read certain images and stuff like that, but if you can avoid, like we saw one where our website had like all their events like had flyers and they looked amazing, like they're really cool, they're flyers, and so like the when the event was, the location, all of that is like in that image. And like you can OCR that and stuff, but it would be a lot easier if it was also included as just text in a readable way. I think layout's really interesting too. Like that's one we've seen too. One of my favorite examples is like a lot of council pages. Sometimes like the way it's laid out will be like non-structured. They won't use tables or any kind of structure or actually like separate them into different div elements. And so what the problem with that is all of a sudden you'll have like image, name, 2 phone numbers, right? Like the content can become very wacky if you don't actually like properly, like have proper containers and separation. So I think those are like probably the 3 that come to mind. There's probably a ton more, but that's at least from my side what I think are some most important ones. Sweet.
Thank you.
Alrighty, well appreciate y'all.